this module, we will discuss about the future scenario of energy crisis. So there are major issue is what type of scenario will be there in future to identify that. Because all of us know that the global energy transition has a rapid change in the energy sector globally. But depending on different new inventions and different policy measures, the scenario will also change. So it's a dynamic aspect, so that nothing can be predicted very accurately what will happen in future. Even with some few years, we can expect that there may be certain disruptive technology innovations which may change the current energy scenario abruptly. And also, depending upon the government policy measures and the global population converging to a common goal to save our earth, there may be different directions of this particular scenario change. So, the energy crisis exists in future. There will be energy crisis of different forms depending on the possible options that the global scenario will move. So the situation can be considered something like this. We are trying to guess at a very long distance which is beyond our visibility. We can use a telescope to make that particular visibility. But be cautious that telescope can show you up to certain distance. There is no assumption because you are looking at a longer distance. But when that comes into the time frame, then nothing is visible clearly like we see through the telescope. So obviously, there will be certain assumptions on the basis of which we have to guess what will be the future energy scenario and associated crisis. It cannot be a single identified picture as it is visible through the telescope at a far distance, not with respect to time. So this can be considered as if a situation like this. That means to assess the future scenario, we can just be at a crossroad where multiple optional paths we can consider. And these paths are not purely arbitrary or optional. These must have certain logical basis, because on the basis of these possible paths, we will try to arrange to face that particular future scenario, and the policy plans will be taken accordingly. And obviously, the action plans will be there at different levels, both at individual nations and also globally as a whole. So, the future scenario analysis is the most important part to identify the energy crisis of the future scenario. Let's consider the different types of future as it is uncertain and what can be the possible options. Now, here, as I am repeatedly telling that in this lecture, I am not trying to making any predictions of the future scenario. But depending on the current scenario, what are the possible different options that can happen, that has to be identified very properly. So, the possible future scenario identification is the most important and critical parameter to identify the challenges and the planning for the mitigation of those. Because unless the scenario is properly assessed, then the challenges identified will also not be proper, and we may not be able to make a proper planning, which is the idea of identifying the future energy scenario crisis. Now, the scenarios we will discuss here, as I am repeatedly telling, are some illustrative only. That means this type of scenario may or may not happen. But the possible outcomes of the challenges or crisis due to those scenarios, if we can assess beforehand, then we can have a proper planning to address those. So on the basis of that, these scenarios are neither forecasts nor claims about future events like an astrologer. So, what we are going to do in this particular presentation, we are trying to make a potential future pathways. What do we mean by that? That means currently with the existing resources, policy planning, and the aspiration of the people, there may be certain possible scenarios that may evolve. And on the basis of analysis of all these factors, we are trying to identify initially the potential future pathways. Because if these pathways are not properly identified, then we will not be able to guess what we are going to face. Now, how these pathways can be influenced, or the possible future scenarios can be or may be influenced. There are multiple factors, because as you all know that the factors like resource and the resource crunch, and with the development of technologies, the requirement or proper resources will also change. Population growth, we can have a guess on the basis of the previous history and the future projection, but honestly speaking, never it can be very accurate, especially on a longer time frame. But with historical data and mathematical possible methodologies, we can have a guess what will be the population with a definite time frame, and based on that, we can at least find out the energy demand. And in addition to the population growth, there will be another issue connected to the energy demand is the living standard. Always we are looking for better living standard than our existing condition. And it is generally directly connected that energy consumption will increase with the living standard improvement of the people. Though this is not directly 1:1 correlation in a sense, currently there is one important issue involved is the energy efficiency and energy conservation, which is represented by the so-called energy intensity. That means gross domestic product, or rather the consumption of the energy divided by the gross domestic product. So the energy consumption per unit of gross domestic product is an indicator of the energy efficiency of a nation. So we can conclude that though with the living standard improvement, there will be a possible increase in demand of the energy simultaneously with the population growth, there can be certain definite energy efficiency measures that can reduce the energy demand to some extent. And another important issue that will influence this future energy scenario is the policy. There are certain existing policy, and in future, to accommodate the situation and meet the target, some new policies may have to be taken either at the national level or at the global level. So all these are expected to influence the so-called future scenario. The significant uncertainties still remain. These uncertainties will originate from disruptive events. These disruptive events may be natural calamities, geopolitical conflicts, or even new technology developments. Why? Because sometimes the new technology development changes the scenario very drastically. For example, the renewable energy is now contributed significantly by solar energy. And all of us know that the efficiency of solar radiation converted to electricity is pretty low. So that demands substantial land area or surface area for installations of solar panels. But if any technology can be developed that will have substantially higher efficiency, solar energy will penetrate into the energy technology market much faster, and that will be the acceptable, better solution as a renewable energy option. So, the disruptive technologies will undoubtedly influence the future energy scenario and the future energy mix. Geopolitical conflicts is very uncertain to tell beforehand, because we know that during geopolitical conflicts, the artificial crisis of the resources arise, and this makes the supply chain quite vulnerable, and many of the countries become energy insecure. So based on these inputs of possible alternative options, we have to consider what can be the future possible pathways for this energy scenario. Now, regarding the possible scenarios mostly predicted by the globally accepted International Energy Agency analysis are being discussed one after another. One of the possible scenarios in future may be the net zero emission 2050. What does it mean? All of you know that to reduce carbon emission from the entire all possible anthropogenic activities, the countries are trying to commit a net zero within certain time frame. That means the countries are committing that by that particular year, the country will make their all sorts of activities in such a way that there will be no carbon emission from that country to the atmosphere. Interestingly, whether this will be possible or not, that's a big question. But the commitment is also required and a good gesture by the countries, because otherwise the impending problem, or rather the expected destruction of the civilization due to the gross effect of the climate change, cannot be avoided. So, the scenario which is called the net zero emission by 2050 is a normative pathway definition. That means due to that, there will be a rapid shift to renewables, which is the option to move towards the net zero path. Increase the energy efficiency, because that's a big driving force for reducing the carbon emission. More the energy efficiency, better we can make our demand fulfilled with lesser energy requirement, and it's always a win-win situation. So, it is very much required to limit the global warming within 1.5 degrees Celsius to reach the net zero emission part. So, this is most probably the most optimistic scenario we are assuming, but this may or may not happen. So, the second alternative options which has been projected by the International Energy Agency is the stated policies scenario or steps. What is the idea? That means on the basis of the future difficulties of carbon emission, every country has taken certain measures. But we have to remember that these measures may not be always sufficient or good enough to their committed net zero by certain year. So what will happen? This scenario is basically falls short of some net zero requirement pathway. That means these are on the basis of current government policies and targets indicating a gradual transition rather than a meeting up of the target of net zero after or rather the beyond within certain year time frame. The third options is current policies scenario. We alternately call it CPS scenario, which assumes no new policies. That means as if whatever is going on currently at different countries and rather overall globally and reflects a conservative outlook on technology adoption. Means as if this scenario is on the basis of business as usual. That means whatever is happening currently, that will continue for some more time when the scenario will emerge, obviously not meeting the net zero, which is the major target globally as assumed for the future. But this scenario analysis will also give us a conservative assessment for what we are expecting to be the energy sector and associated crisis for that energy sector on the basis of this assumption. There are certain more scenario predicted by other organizations like World Energy Council, Rystad Energy, etc. I'm not going into discussing these options because the time is short, but obviously what is the conclusion from this different scenario analysis is that not necessarily all possible options we can consider to assess the future scenario. We have to depend on certain assumptions, and we are relying on the experience of this well-known global organizations to make a possible option that will happen in future. On the basis of these scenarios, we have to now explore what are the key driving force or drivers and trends that are shaping this particular scenario. No doubt, the most important part of making all these scenarios will be the population growth rate. Because more the people, more will be the energy demand, and more critical will be the supply chain management to meet the demand. The expected growth of energy is 27% to 61% by 2050. Interestingly, you see the range of variation that we are assuming. Yes, it is very difficult to predict very accurately what will be the global population by 2050. But, depending on the possible range of 27% to 61%, we can plan for the future scenario. And during that period, the energy demand may be grossly affected due to some new development like AI and increased cooling loads. All of you are aware that with the climate change and with improved living standard, people are getting habituated to have their comfort during summer, and for that the cooling load is increasing in tropical countries day by day. And obviously, this increasing cooling load will have a very important impact on the energy demand in future. And AI also needs the cooling of the data center, and with increasing use of the AI, this demand will also increase. Renewable growth will be another very key driver. Currently, the scenario is such that solar and wind energy are emerging as the most dominating two renewable options. But the growth rate and this regional deployment is also not uniform globally. Somewhere the solar installation has been significantly, and due to several reasons, it has not been to that extent in some other parts of the country. Similarly, the wind, and obviously, this will depend on the natural resources available at that location too. So, the renewable growth will be another important driving force. Energy security is more important than the meeting the target of the net zero for countries. Unless the energy security is satisfied, people cannot just go for the net zero target at the global level. So we have to focus on diversified and local energy supplies. And in addition, the geopolitical conflicts and the climate risk will always remain for this energy security issue associated. A new crisis is expected in future. We are moving from the fossil fuel regime to the renewable energy regime. And in renewable energy regime, technologies for the energy production will be completely different from the fossil fuel based technology. So, the material requirement for this renewable energy regime will be substantially different from the conventional fossil fuel based power generation system. And interestingly, with identification of these critical minerals, the global geopolitical politics has already started, some new shape or orientation. For example, the energy transition will depend on several bottlenecks on the particular materials, that having those materials will make this possible and to implement these clean technologies. So what will happen? The countries, they have it, they are lucky. Just like fossil fuels the countries have earlier, they were lucky. But now the shift will change from fossil fuel to certain critical materials. For the materials like lithium, nickel, cobalt, manganese and graphite will be very much critical for energy storage. So, countries having these, or countries having the control of these minerals in other countries, will have a definite edge in future. Then rare earth elements are essential for the permanent magnets which are required for the wind turbines and electric vehicle motors. So obviously rare earth elements are another component which will be very much important in future energy scenario. Electricity networks day by day has to be such that the loss in those transmission etc. will be lesser. And in that case, highly conducting materials like aluminum and copper, specifically copper, will be of high demand for future energy scenario. So, these different types of materials that will actually be very much required for switching over to the new energy transition will play a critical role in the future energy scenario. These will be one of the key drivers of the shaping the scenario of the future energy world. Now, undoubtedly the future scenario, whatever it may be, is full of several challenges. What are those important challenges? I am making a summary. Most important is the population growth and the energy demand increase. However, these two are correlated with respect to the energy efficiency measures, how much we can take. The next one will be the modern technologies like AI, automation, electric vehicle, etc. This will increase the energy demand, and automatically this will be one of the key driver of the future energy scenario. And obviously the electricity demand may increase even more than the as usual requirement these days in future. Supply chain of critical minerals, obviously I have discussed that. That may be the future issue of energy politics in a sense, and assuring the energy security of the countries. Then the climate change and dependent and depleting fossil fuels transformed into the net zero commitments may have certain very important influence on the future energy scenario. And extreme weather events are expected to influence the future energy scenario due to climate change, will have certain impact on the future scenario. The traditional grid may also change into some other microgrids or smart grids. So economic disparity among countries may also lead to future global conflicts. These will all influence the future energy scenario. Thank you.